And welcome, friends, to the Wednesday edition of the Grace Hour. We're broadcasting live here from our studios, which are located at the home of the Greater Grace World Outreach in Baltimore, Maryland. Great to be with you today, friends. Thanks so much for joining us for the Wednesday broadcast. And we hope you'll stay with us for the next 45 minutes or so as we'll again continue to develop our theme throughout this week on the Grace Hour, which is discovering the gifts of the Spirit. Today, we'll focus on one of those gifts, leadership, and ask the question, is leadership something that comes to someone by nature, or is it something that's nurtured? We'll talk about that and other, I suppose other principles that are related to the subject of leadership. That's going to be our Grace Hour broadcast today, so we encourage you to stay with us. Quick reminder, too, if you'd like to weigh in, share your thoughts with us on the chat, you can do that. Just send those messages to us or ask those questions. We'll be happy to take a look at them as the program continues live from our studios today. My name is Pastor John Love. Along with Pastor Barry Quirk, we will be your hosts for today's Grace Hour broadcast. Our prayer is, of course, that today's broadcast will minister to you, encourage you in your walk of faith, and perhaps give you some insight and shed some light on the subject of leadership. One thing's for sure, Pastor Barry, we all need leadership in our lives, and we all flourish under the right kind of leadership.
Yes, that's a great statement, Pastor Love. Good morning. Good to be with you. I'm reminded right off the top of a story I heard from a pastor in Hungary who bought a piece of property, and on that piece of property, there was a goat. And when he went to buy the property, he told the real estate agent, "I'll take the property, but I don't want the goat." They said, "I'm sorry, but the goat goes with the property." So he said, "Okay, well, I really want the property, so I'll take the goat." So he had a little shed out there where the goat lived, and he went out there and decided, "I'll clean the stall out a little bit." So he went and grabbed the harness and put it on the goat and tried to pull it out. And the goat just did not want to be pulled out, and it wouldn't go. So he said, "Okay, well, I'm a pretty big guy. I'll get behind the goat and push it." And pushed it, and goat wouldn't move. Rolled up a newspaper and swatted it on the backside. Said, "You got to get out of here. Let's go." The goat didn't move. So finally he said, "Fine, I'll do this later." And he turned around and walked out. And as soon as he walked out, the goat followed him. And it was a great illustration. You know, people don't want to be pushed. They don't want to be pulled. They don't want to be beaten. They want to be led. And I think that right off the top, leadership, we could say, is an influence relation among leaders and followers that causes followers to want to follow the initiative of that leader. So it's a good subject, something to talk about, and I'm looking forward to hearing what your thoughts are on that this morning.
Well, the first thought that comes to my mind, and I think it's a question that's often asked by people when it comes to the subject of leadership, is it something that a person is born with, or is it something that is nurtured in a person's life? And I think rather than taking one side or the other, I think you could safely say that it's probably both.
Yeah, I mean, there are definite opinions on that, and there's something called trait theory, which focuses on the traits and skills that a leader exhibits from a young age. He's a born leader, you might say. But really, biblically, we don't see a lot of that. You know, we see maybe Moses has some leadership skills that he was born with that are there. Deborah is another maybe possibility or an example that we could say, you know, she was the fourth of 15 judges, and she was a strong woman of God, and she likely didn't receive much leadership training. But really, throughout the rest of the Bible, we see people who are raised up in their leadership. So is it possible that somebody could be born with some leadership skills? Yes, but to think that that's enough, it's really not. They need to be developed. They need to be guided. They need to be mentored. On the other hand, you know, there are some that have learned leadership through watching good leaders and being good followers. And I think a key for all leadership is that the best leaders are the ones who learned how to be followers first.
Well, that's a good definition for a leader, someone who follows first,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
You mentioned Moses. In Moses' case, God arranged it so that he was adopted into Pharaoh's household and schooled like as a royal child. And, he perhaps more fully understood and was indoctrinated into the ways of the Egyptian and their government. And that would be helpful later on when he went back to liberate the people of Israel. But you could also say those 40 years that he spent in the desert were perhaps even more important than the first 40 years as God was preparing him and really developing him. And interestingly enough, the backside of the desert.
Yes. Yeah, and if you were to interview him and ask him what had a greater impact on his life, I think he would agree with you. You know, that there was a time of being in the backside of the desert where he was going through the school of hard knocks, so to speak, but also reflecting, being developed. So I think we have to be careful, that we as natural observers would look at a situation and say, good leader, bad leader. I was reading this morning from Acts chapter 7, just about the story of Stephen being stoned, and I don't know why, but I just never really noticed it like this. But at the end of the chapter, it says, and Saul was basically excited that happened, right? It says that he was a full supporter of that. And it just struck me. It said, wow, in 2 chapters time, he's going to be on the road to Damascus and he's going to be there, meeting the Lord face to face and having a conversion experience that will make him the apostle of grace, right? But just a short time earlier, he's rejoicing at the fact that Stephen's been stoned for his blasphemous activities. And I'm thinking, how quickly could somebody be transformed from, an enemy of God to an agent of grace? And I think in leadership, we could be judgmental in our hearts. We could say that this person is going to succeed or isn't. And actually, in our experience in the school and probably the youth group as well, you see people who maybe live a little bit on the edge, and we would think, oh, they're not behaving, they're not going to be good leaders. But actually, it's quite the opposite. They're not the wallflowers. I like the thought of Dr. Howard Hendricks in one of his teaching techniques. He says, a person who's a wallflower in the beginning could end up being a wallflower later on. So there is something to the trying and the failing and the error and the doing the different things, and also one other thing we brought up this morning was that, and I heard a little bio on Spurgeon this morning on the radio, and Spurgeon was 15 years old when he wandered into a church and heard a message on look to the Lord and you'll be saved. And it revolutionized his life. And here we are, this was in the 1890s or something. And here we are all these years later, 135 years later, and we are reading his devotionals, being ministered to by his life. And even though he was the prince of preachers, his life commitment was to share the gospel everywhere he went. He led people without his pulpit. He led people while he was in his pulpit. And the result was at his funeral, there were thousands and thousands of people in England who came to recognize this man. And it's just incredible how God is doing this raising up process. And some may have the skills in the beginning. Some may not even understand they have the skills. Amos is a shepherd from the herdsmen of Tekoa, and God raises him up to be used. And I don't know, it's an amazing thing to watch the hand of God in developing leaders. Some with born traits, as you say, some with developed traits, but ultimately neither one being valuable unless God does something with it and the person is humble enough to operate that way.
Yeah, humility is definitely the key. Verses that come to my mind about this subject when we think of leaders and the raising up of leaders is Psalm 75, verse 6, 7, and 8. It says, "For exaltation comes neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south, but God is the judge. He puts down one and exalts another."
Yeah.
That's amazing to me. Because sometimes, as you said, you can look at some people and you see, oh, there's potential for leadership. And yet sometimes that leadership potential is never realized, while you may not even look at someone else because you see no potential for leadership, and yet God will raise that person up. I've always thought in my heart that God doesn't have a problem raising people up. He might have some challenges bringing them down to a point where he can begin to raise them up and use them in positions of leadership. Like we mentioned Moses. Well, okay, did the palace of Pharaoh help to develop his leadership skills? Perhaps. But what about the one that would follow him upon his death, Joshua? That was 40 years of training under Moses' leadership. And he was being developed by God and used by God and prepared by God to take the children of Israel from the brink of the promised land and to lead them into that land. That's real leadership. But in both cases, and you mentioned it a moment ago, the one characteristic that really we see in their lives was failure.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
John Maxwell wrote a book called Failing Forward. And he said, what makes the difference in people's lives, those that achieve so much and those that perhaps achieve so little? He says, is it family background? He said, not necessarily. Wealth? No, not really. Opportunity? No. He says, because sometimes two people with similar gifts, talents, and resources look at the same situation. One sees tremendous opportunity, the other sees nothing. High morals? No. The absence of hardship? For every achiever, he says, who has avoided tragedy, there's a Helen Keller who overcame extreme disabilities, or a Viktor Frankl who survived absolute horrors in the Holocaust. He says the real difference between average people and achieving people, leadership in their lives, is their perception and response to failure.
Wow.
That's really remarkable.
Very.
That might make you and I great leaders.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we learn.
Yeah.
I mean, we learn so much. And, the difference between maybe a natural leader and a spiritual leader is that a spiritual leader is not afraid to grow from his mistakes. And a natural leader maybe tries to cover up his mistakes because it has a poor reflection of who he thinks he should be. But I am convinced that God is looking for people who he can use and to demonstrate life. And how much more powerful is it to have, let's say in a marriage, you're married and you have a child, and your child is observing everything that's going on in your marriage. And sometimes they observe failure. They observe me treating my wife unkindly, or, whatever, an argument or something, or an assumption, or, an edict from the throne of dad. And at the end of the day, it's very obvious that was a bad edict and that I made a bad decision. And to be able to say to my child, hey, you know what? I blew it. I shouldn't have reacted that way. I was unkind to your mother. I was unkind to you. I said something that I shouldn't have. And they just learned grace, right? One of the best lessons of the whole picture was that in humility, I could say I'm wrong, and God corrected me. And that as a result, there's a restoration of a relationship. That's an incredible leadership skill, right? Or a gift of leadership. And it could be that there's denial and don't do as I say, don't do as I do, just do as I say, or, making some excuse up for why it happened. But none of those would teach anything profitable. It would just teach, regret. And so I love the fact that God can use failure. Yeah. I mean, it's a good thing because we have it in droves.
Yes. And when you think of the disciples, I mean, that was a group of 12 failures.
Yeah.
No question. And then, of course, who did Jesus choose to preach at Pentecost? The biggest failure of them all.
Absolutely.
Peter.
Yes.
And it's incredible because he was, think about his background, raised up from this humble backcountry of like a fisherman. And here he is. He's going to be an apostle of the Messiah, and he's going to preach at Pentecost, and he's going to write epistles. This is it's remarkable. God can do anything that he wants to do. We know that. He's sovereign. But he does seem to choose people that recognize that the sufficiency of leadership is not discovered or found in them. It's found in him.
Yes.
Paul said that. He said, not that we are sufficient of these things or anything that has to do with the ministry, but our sufficiency, it comes from God.
Amen. And actually, when we consider who is God in that picture, who is God in the leadership picture, and what's our example? I mean, obviously, Philippians chapter 2 speaks about Jesus being a servant, and we'll get into that, servant leadership and what does that look like. We can get it twisted. We can think of ourselves as being a leader, which means I should have people's respect and honor and following, but it doesn't focus on where am I leading them to or what am I leading. Leadership isn't just something that's an end unto itself. Like I'm a leader. God's called me in this life to be a leader. Follow me. And like, follow you where? Follow you what? What is the vision? Without a vision, the people perish.
Yes.
And I like this definition of biblical leadership, because there are some definitions that are, kind of technical and you could say fit into spiritual definitions or not. But this is a good one. It says, biblical leadership is meeting someone where they are and taking them to where Jesus wants them to go. This is a great, this is Todd Engstrom wrote an article about it. Biblical leadership is meeting someone right where they are and taking them where Jesus wants them to go. And it's a great picture, because really that's the picture of me walking and the goat following, like there's leadership that God's designed starts with the leader, right? And this is what servant leadership really is focused on, is that I'm not at the top of a pyramid with a whole group of servants below me saying, I want this, I want that, you do this, you do that. And then at the end, I hope that I get the result that I want. It's what do you need as somebody who's in our organism rather than organization? What is it that you need, the resources that you need, the support that you need, the care that you need? I'm going to be here at the bottom supporting you, and all of that happens above. And this was really the model that Jesus took upon himself, that he was from God in heaven, took upon himself the form of a man and became a servant of all servants so that we could shine and live with God forever.
He really defines what leadership is when he said these words, I am among you as he that serves.
Yes.
I mean, that just kind of sums it all up.
Yes.
Because, a good question we could ask is leadership, does it really come down to that? Is it just simply a gift of the Spirit imparted to some, and then others perhaps they don't recognize that, and therefore they conclude, look, I'm not a leader, I won't be a leader. But in reality, every servant is a leader in the kingdom of God.
Yes.
And I just find it fascinating that when Moses did pass away at the age of 120, God spoke to Joshua in Joshua, the first chapter. And I love the way he asked the question or made the statement. He said, Moses, my servant, is dead.
Yes.
He didn't say Moses, my leader.
Yes.
Moses, the guy that's responsible for getting the children of Israel out of their bondage in Egypt and bring them through the wilderness for the last 40 years. He called him his servant. There's something to be said about that whole business of servant leadership. It really comes down to that. We, in our ministry, and perhaps like other churches, we sit on a platform. It's on a stage, so It's above where the rest of the people. But that doesn't mean, look at those people, they're the leaders. What it really means is that they are the ones who serve us.
Yes.
And if we're not serving, are we really leading?
No, and I would say even a step beyond that, they're the ones that are accountable, right? So if we're accountable, and the picture of being on that platform is a good one, and especially in times of difficulty like we found ourselves in here in recent days, and it's how easy it could be to say, avoid the limelight, avoid the platform, don't be seen there, and we would choose to think the opposite. We would think of all the more now, let's be present, let's be followers of Jesus Christ. And to some degree, every single person has a measure of leadership in their lives. And if it's nothing more than how they walk in their walk with God, that is a leadership by example. We could be a quiet, introverted person, but have firm convictions in our heart that following God is the most important thing in my life. And there's going to be people observing our life and saying, that person follows God. They don't say a lot. They're not very boisterous, but they are fervent and consistent. And I think we know people like that who are just followers of God. And in a sense, leading people by their testimony and their display all the time. And it might not even be their motive. I'm sure in most cases it's not. People who are really, really servants of God, they're doing it because this is what God's asked them to do. And the result is God's to use. And as you said, promotion comes from heaven, right? It doesn't come from people. It comes from God. And true promotion, which has a lot of accountability, a lot of responsibility, a lot of definition that needs to come from God, and our ability to hear that will be what drives us in our leadership. Or if we aren't hearing that, then the leadership will get old and stale, and we'll be without a vision very quickly because it's just a human trait. And, we all know people who we enjoy being around because they're kind of, the outgoing ones, or if you're in trouble, you think, oh, they'll know what to do. But really, people who are tied to the voice of God as their direction are the ones that I want to put my confidence in.
I'll never forget, 9/11 happened on a Tuesday morning of September in 2001. And I'll never forget, there was so much, it was such a crisis. I mean, it was all unfolding before our eyes. And now we can look back on it. We realize everything that happened and when it happened and how it happened. But while it was happening, we didn't understand very much.
No, we didn't.
At first, I heard that a small plane flew into the building, and I imagined that it was an accident. And then, of course, it all began to unfold. That was a Tuesday morning. The fear and the paralyzing effects of 9/11 carried on throughout the day and throughout the night as we watched the images over and over and over again. But I thought to myself, I cannot wait until church service Wednesday night. And because our pastor at the time, Pastor Stevens, would get into the pulpit and he would give us definition. He would bring us hope. He would bring comfort. And it's because of the vision that leadership imparts to people that helped us to get through that time of crisis as a church and, as a city, as a nation, through good leadership. Because vision was once described to me as a mental picture of a desirable future. And I love that because that's what was mapped out before our eyes and before our hearts on that Wednesday evening. We left church service hopeful, confident in God, trusting him in a more deep way than we had in the past. And I mean, we could go on. And a lot of people struggled to go on after 9/11, but we could go on because we had someone in a position of leadership that was imparting vision to us.
Wow.
And it was really very, very helpful.
Yeah. I mean, it's the model, right?
Yes.
And how much courage does it take in the midst of troublous times to say, God is in control, right? Because you have to stand up before people and point to something that they can't necessarily see. They could see the buildings coming down. They could see the Pentagon. They could see the things that were happening. And I remember also as it was unfolding, and a funny story, my wife was at a meeting, and it was in the early days of cell phones. We had cell phones, but they weren't so prevalently used. And I called and called and called, and she finally picked up her phone and said, I can't talk now, I'm in a meeting, and hung up and put it back in her pocketbook. And then an hour later, when I finally got a hold of her, I said, you do realize the world's coming to an end and our daughter's in kindergarten and I got to pick her up, right? And it was just so surreal. It was surreal. And I remember even, I had an appointment that evening in Washington, D.C., and I went on the appointment. It was a sales appointment. I thought, if they still want to have me here, it's going to be a good sale, so I'm going. But it was the strangest thing, like being in the city and not hearing any airplanes, because as you know, Dulles and National and BWI and those airports are right there. Not a single plane except for like a military jet circling around. And it was such an odd time. So there was no natural system to rest on. Like I could imagine Pastor Stevens getting up and to tell people, be strong and be courageous and God's on the throne. That is a big leap, you know?
Yeah.
But really, this is what leadership is. Leadership is not occupied with the external things, right? And even, although it has to take into consideration where people are at, that there could be people who are fearful, as I'm sure many people were still very shaken and, you know, are we going to have an all-out war or what's happening in our country? And to be able to proclaim the thoughts of God in the midst of that, that's the kind of leadership that I want to be around.
Yeah, and we were so grateful that we had it at that critical time in our nation's history.
Yes.
Is leadership something that is earned, or I mean, we read here in Psalm 75 that, you know, it comes from God. He raises one up, he puts another down. Mm-hmm. So I guess we can't necessarily say that it's earned, but maybe a better way to describe it is that it can be recognized.
Sure.
And when it's recognized, then an investment can be made and a nurturing can take place and a developing of that leadership ability and skill, whether it's something that's come naturally or it's something that's being nurtured in them. You can develop that. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't say that it's earned, because like anything and everything in our lives as believers, every good gift comes from above. It comes from God.
Yes.
So he gives it to us. But I think the danger that could potentially be found in leadership is that we start to look at ourselves and think, you know, this is who I am. You know, we hear it so often, I'm a self-made man.
Yes.
You know, and I earned my place in the company or in the church. When in reality, no. If we get to minister to anyone, whether it's behind a pulpit or in a nursing home or in a hospital room, it's really by the grace of God, isn't it?
It really is. And you think about Saul and Barnabas, right, who were ministering unto the Lord. And that's when the Holy Spirit recognized and said, separate unto me Saul and Barnabas, right? Like they were ministering to the Lord, and that's what qualified them to be used as servants of the Lord. And in their activities, they were recognized because of their humility and following the voice of God. And it marked their steps along the way. And sure, they had their difficult times, and I'm sure moments of unbelief, or just like any human being would. But ultimately, they were tied to serving the Lord. And really, that's the kind, like when you think about leadership, can it be, you know, is it earned? Is it, and I always think of this, like the difference between commanding respect and demanding respect. Like if we demand respect as a leader, I'm the leader, you will respect me. You may get people who do that on the outside. We see that in some of these tyrannical countries like North Korea or something like that, that they're crying because the great leader is there in their midst, but it's all a big show so that they don't get their heads cut off, right? Yeah. Demanding somebody's respect versus your life commanding respect. And I think like the ultimate way that we command respect is by not demanding it. It's by walking in the steps that God has set before us as a leader and letting that be the thing that motivates us. Am I in God's mind for today, for my life? And I think that does, you know, in the first place, it's God that puts his hand on leadership, right? Like Saul and Barnabas were separated because they were serving the Lord and they were recognized. And then it says that the elders came and laid hands on them and sent them out. There was a recognition of their gifts. There was a demonstration of the authority put on them by the leaders of the time. And then they were sent in the name of Christ to be his apostles and his disciples and in their practical life. And I think it's the same way today. You know, like somebody could be anointed by God to be a leader, but it's God that puts their hand on their life, and it's God that keeps them in the ministry of their life and the leadership of their life. And that's what brings followers. It's not like, you know, and there are, Steve Jobs was a guy who was a charismatic guy who was leader and had vision. And when he presented something, people wanted to follow him. So there is a natural charisma that could be followed. But there's something deeper and there's something more, and it causes us to stop looking at the outward charisma and natural leadership and good to look at, and the difference between Saul and David, right?
Yeah.
There's a leader. There's one that is raised up that looks attractive in my eyes. There's a person who's going to get the heart of God and follow it. And that's really one of the big differences, I would say, between natural leadership, spiritual leadership, and whether it's earned or whether it's developed or whether it's grown, all has to do with how much it's tied to God's mind for the situation.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, when you read, for instance, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Romans chapter 12, and in Ephesians, the 4th chapter, it talks a lot about the gifts of God, the gifts of the Spirit. But there's no gift called leadership, which is interesting. I mean, there's teaching and preaching and the gift of helps and prophecy and a word of wisdom and working of miracles. And again, that list can go on for quite some time. But the point being is that there's no gift that says you will have the gift of leadership.
Yeah.
As you said, it's something that God sees in a person and begins to develop. For instance, David, he wasn't king of Israel overnight.
That's right.
He was taking care of his father's sheep, and nobody knew who he was, and nobody cared to know who he was. Yet God was raising him up. Yeah. Again, maybe not in the backside of the desert, but in the sheepfold.
Might as well have been in the backside.
Exactly.
Right.
And even John the Baptist, where is he?
Yeah.
Before his ministry begins in the New Testament, he is in the deserts and in isolation alone with God.
Yeah.
And that developing is taking place. So it's not so much what people can see that, is attractive about a person. And natural ability, as you just shared, might not cut it in the kingdom of God.
That's right.
It takes
Might get in
a
the way.
Spirit-filled, gifted person.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And, like Nehemiah lifted up the vision, and people followed because he was lifting up the vision, not because he was promoting himself as the answer, not because he said, I need you to be followers of me, but here's the vision. And the fact that he had a heart after, I want to follow God's mind for this situation, caused other people to be drawn into that vision, right? And there's a good verse here in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 16, where Paul says, take heed unto thyself and unto thy doctrine. Continue in them, for in doing this, thou shalt both be saved and them that hear thee, right? So really the direction there in the pastoral epistle is take heed to what God's mind is, what his word says, what his command is, that not only are you going to be saved, but those that hear you are going to be saved. And that's like a great issuing of the gift of leadership. You're right. It doesn't say there are other gifts that are listed, pastor, teacher, apostle, all those things. But in each one of those, the gift of leadership is a very big part of it, but in a very different way.
Right.
Right. In some, they are the leader. In others, they are not. They're followers, but in a sense are leading people in their following. And it's like, what is the constant there? That, I need to know God's mind. I need his word in my life. I need his character in my life. I need to know what his purpose is in my life. And along the way, he very well could be leading us to become somebody that's a leader, but it's done with his hands and not our own.
Yeah. Amazing. You think of Jesus and the upper room discourse. The first thing that we read about is that he girded himself with a towel.
Yes.
And he began to wash the feet of his disciples.
Yes.
And then instructed them to do the same thing for one another. That image, it should be, when you see that, you think, no, this is wrong. It should be the other way around. They should be girding themselves with a towel and washing his feet. But that's not the leadership model that he wanted his disciples to learn.
That's right.
And it was to serve and to minister and to wash people's feet. We're not talking literally here, but you have a ministry where if you can help someone to get back on their feet after they've stumbled, if you can help someone to put their bad past behind them and to look ahead into the future and to have hope in their hearts, these are the kinds of things that God is looking for in the hearts of his leaders today. Yes,
absolutely. And I think about, we remember that message that Pastor Schauer preached, the closet, the towel, and the table. And it's really a discourse at the end of John chapter 12 and the beginning of John 13. It speaks about how Jesus departed and he hid himself from them in a closet of meditation and refreshment, really is what it's saying. He went into the closet alone, the place alone before the Lord, so that he could meditate and be raised up in his thinking with God. And he left there, and then he goes in and he girds himself up with a towel, the same thing. And then he began to minister to the disciples by washing their feet once again. And then that was the thing that ended up taking them to the fellowship at the table was, look at the way that Jesus' love is commended toward us, that he is serving us in a way that is very demonstrative. I don't know how you could walk away from that experience and say, as a leader, we need to be ones that are raising up people to serve us. It was very, very clear that I am a servant and this is what I'm doing, washing your feet for that very purpose. And it is very distinct and clear. It's the greatest school of leadership that we could ever go to, between Philippians 2 and the two portions we just talked about with the washing of feet.
Mm. And I think one of the most destructive things about leadership is when ambition finds its way into the hearts of leaders. There is a great verse in Jeremiah chapter 45, verse 5. It says, do you seek great things for yourself? You ask that question to the average person, they might say, yes, absolutely. Yeah. That's why I'm alive. Yes. That's my goal. That's my ambition. That's my target.
Yeah.
And then we read, if the question is asked, do you seek great things for yourself? Don't seek them. Seek them not.
Yeah.
But if you have a life that's consecrated to Christ because his love and his grace has captured your heart, you could answer that by saying, no, I do not seek great things for myself. I seek glory for God. That's when God can use you.
Yes.
But because, if we start to believe the newspaper clippings about ourselves, we're in a lot of trouble. Although sometimes we're not in trouble. We may be blessed.
Yes.
But the point is, beware when all men speak well of you.
Oh, totally.
Right?
Yeah.
You got to guard your heart.
Yeah. And really, the ironic thing about the kingdom of God is that we seek nothing. We follow him. We seek his mind, actually. We seek to give glory to God. And along the way, we get a lot of blessings.
Yes.
We are taken care of. Mm-hmm. We really are. It's because our trust is in him fully, which means even to be the provision for our need. Right. And I'm not saying that we're poor stewards, like we say, I don't need a job. I'm just going to go and pray every day and God will take care of me. No, he's clear about if a man doesn't labor, then he shouldn't eat. And there are different things. He gives us capacity to be a part of, the call that he has for our lives. But ultimately, do we trust him for every area of that? Which means if I have a job, right, and I'm in a workplace, do I treat it as though it's the gift of God with stewardship and with kindness and addressing people in a way that's proper, or am I, regretting every day of it? And I'm not saying we have to love the fact that we have to work all day long, but if we're going to be working, isn't it more awesome to say, all right, this is where God put me, so he obviously has a provision for me in this place, and to be able to see it through the eyes of an eternal viewpoint rather than just a temporal one, and it'll make the days go by quicker. Also, we'll see a ministry in it to people. What is that ministry? I don't know, but maybe it's to the person who's casually observing you do that mundane job over and over, and they say, how is it that every day you come in here, you have a joy in your heart and a pep in your step? How is that possible? And it's like, well, this is what God's done in my life, and this is the provision that he's given me, and I don't regret that provision. And yeah, but don't you want more for your life? And I want whatever God has for my life. And it is more even when it's not, right? And, there's a distinction. Maybe a couple of quick thoughts here about leadership and bosses. Leaders have become servants, right? Bosses are self-serving. Everything that they do is really self-serving. Leaders serve others. Bosses are concerned with position. Leaders are concerned with character. Bosses lead from the sidelines. Leaders lead from within the arena. Bosses attempt to exercise authority. Leaders are under authority, right? Couple more. Bosses seek to preserve their position. Leaders seek to train, develop, and replace themselves with others, right? This is a beautiful thing. Like God leads us into a place and says, develop others to take over that place. And maybe you go do it again somewhere else. But it's always developing. Bosses demand authority. Leaders let their lives command authority. So these are just some things about servant leadership. And the picture in our mind of the way that Jesus did it is he didn't sit at the top of the pyramid and say, I'm the big boss and everybody listen to me. Although his life clearly made it clear that that was the case. But it was by his actions and his humility and his love and his desire to serve us by love that he gives us a very great picture, which is the pyramid is upside down and he's at the base of it with the support and the leadership and the serving of others, which really is a model for the way that we should be walking in our own lives.
Yeah. And as you described the difference between leaders and bosses, before coming into the ministry, I worked for both.
Yeah.
I can clearly and vividly remember the bosses, and I can clearly and vividly remember the leaders.
Yeah.
And it was always such a joy to work under the leaders.
Yes.
Because they always worked with you.
Yeah.
They were, as you said, they weren't on the sidelines. They were right there in the field of play.
Yeah. Yeah. And the vision that somebody has, it's a great thing to be a part of a move of God when something is happening. And at the end of the day, be able to say, man, thank you, God, for this team, right, that you gave us that could produce this work. I don't want all the work. I don't want the glory. What glory? The glory goes to God.
Yeah.
So why are we even concerned about that? And I think it's a far more glorious day when at the end of it I can say, I don't know how it happened today, God, but we found ourselves perfectly in the center of your plan, and we watched your provision take us through a tough situation, and at the end of the day, your glory was raised, and we're just so happy to be a part of it. It's so much more rewarding.
Yeah.
Then, hey, look at me, look what I did, look how I led this troop through this battle, and at the end of it, the troop is bitter. The victory is very short-lived and temporal, and there's no glory to God.
Wow. Well, some great thoughts on the subject of leadership, and it is rooted in God. It's rooted in the spiritual gifts that God imparts to those who function in those positions of leadership. We're so grateful for them. And remember, friends, as we close the broadcast today, wherever you are, whoever you are, there's an opportunity for you to lead. Again, a good definition of a leader is a follower who just simply follows first.
Yes.
Take the first step. Don't be surprised if you see others following in your footsteps. Pastor Barry, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thank you, Pastor.
Always good to have you here in the studio with us. And quick reminder, friends, the Thursday edition of the Grace Hour coming up a little less than 24 hours from now. We hope you'll tune in then. And please don't forget to subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and everywhere else where you can find the ministry of the Grace Hour. Until tomorrow, may God bless you.